Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Mind your business. Only on Money FM 89.3.
Thanks for joining us on The Breakfast Show. It's Mind Your Business with me, Audrey Seek, alongside Ahmad Akhtar. Now, once upon a time, the Chief Risk Officer, or CRO, was more of a behind-the-scenes figure. But today, the CRO is stepping out of the shadows and into the spotlight. They're not just managing risk, they're helping shape company strategy, build resilience, and even unlock new competitive advantages. In a world where volatility is the new normal, risk leadership isn't just about saying no, it's about asking what if and making sure your organization is ready for whatever's next.
In the Asia Pacific, organizations are pretty under-indexed on the role, with just over 42% of corporates reporting they have a CRO in place. So how did the role evolve so dramatically? Let's find out with Ashley Wallace, who's the Managing Director, Head of Financial Services Asia Pacific at Russell Reynolds Associates. Good morning, Ashley.
Good morning, Audrey and Ahmed. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. All right, so let's kick things off with the big picture, Ashley. What are some of the key external forces right now, whether geopolitical, technological, regulatory, that are pushing risk higher up the agenda for companies, especially in APAC?
Yes, Audrey. There's so many, and I think the stakes have really never been higher. And you mentioned a few. There's, of course, geopolitical and socioeconomic volatility, more volatile than ever. I'm sure that's a word that you both hear quite a lot on your show. There's technology advancements that are causing strategic disruption and cyber threat. Cybersecurity, it's no longer just an IT issue. It's a broad strategic challenge, and it can affect every aspect of an organization. And then a few others, regulatory changes, the influx of private capital, another key factor fundamentally reshaping the financial services industry and also the broader economy, rising cost pressures, expanding stakeholder expectations. The list goes on, really.
It's a rather long list. How do you prioritize which risks to take on first?
Look, I think that's the big key with chief risk officers these days is they have to be agile. They have to really balance what is a very complex environment. So I think in terms of prioritization, I think that's been some of the issues of the past is being more reactive and not having sort of that organizational resilience to kind of withstand all these different pressures. So I think it's really about instilling that resilience within the organization and throughout the organization that's going to be the top priority rather than having to just kind of play a game of whack-a-mole, if you will.
Yeah, so let's rewind a little bit, Ashley. Historically, there's been maybe a tendency to underinvest in the CRO role here in APAC. Why do you think that's been the case? And are boards and CEOs starting to see its value differently now, especially with so much volatility?
Yeah, absolutely, Audrey. Look, some of the reasons I think that this function has potentially been either underinvested in or potentially just undervalued has really been a couple things. One, it's difficult to quantify the ROI of risk management. It's one of those things that, you realize it in retrospect. And so I think sometimes that a lot of companies have fallen into that trap of being really focused on that ROI and waiting for an issue to happen before they realize the value. I also think that in some ways there can be a misunderstanding of the CRO role. Historically, it's not just a no-sayer, not just someone who's a strategic blocker, but really we're seeing boards and CEOs really look at this as more of a strategic partner. And in fact, that's a real competitive advantage.
Yeah, can we dive a little bit deeper into the specifics of how you would define the role of a CRO then in an organization? What are some of the boundaries between enterprise risk, compliance, and internal audit? Is it all encompassing?
Look, I'd say it's all encompassing. I think obviously there are boundaries across the different lines of defense. And I think, if an organization thinks just bringing in a top chief risk officer is going to solve all their problems, then, that's another issue. It can't be underpinned by one person and one function. It's got to be really instilled across the culture of the organization and across the different lines of defense, as you mentioned. But really, it's critical that you get this right from the start and that it's coming from the top down.
So you talked about, trying to move away from this being just a reactionary kind of role and actually be part of a company's strategic planning. What's the risk pardon the pun, of continuing to treat risk management as just a kind of like a back office compliance function rather than as a leadership seat at the table? Should they be front and center as well, next to the CEO, maybe CFO?
Absolutely. I think that the most forward-looking organizations that we see, and this is across all industries, really recognize that a strong CRO and CEO dynamic isn't just a competitive advantage, it's a necessity, or vice versa, it's both. And I think it's critical that what we're seeing today as well is that CROs, the most effective CROs, have to have that unique blend of commercial acumen, strategic foresight, stakeholder influence, leadership agility. These are no longer sort of the technical kind of traditional CROs that many people may think of the past. It's moved on from that quite substantially.
Are there any standout examples of organizations that have empowered this CRO role that you describe, and what were the outcomes?
Yeah, look, I think there are lots of examples. I think, obviously, from a confidentiality perspective, we don't typically talk about actual companies, at the risk of, I don't want to include or disclude any of our clients, but there's a lot of phenomenal examples of, where you can see risk being prioritized. And a lot of that we see, I can give you, an example of kind of what some of the characteristics of that are. I think when a board is really out there looking for a chief risk officer, and is focusing on, again, leadership qualities, ability to connect the dots, to manage stakeholders, to communicate, versus just looking at tick-the-box risk, technical experience, that's a real indicator that this company is on a forward-looking path when it comes to risk and is truly shifting that view from kind of the, as you said, Audrey, at the beginning, kind of in the shadows to into the light.
Yeah, so if a company wants to get serious about risk leadership, where should they start? One or two practical steps they can take. Are we talking about increasing budgets or investing in tech or maybe something deeper like culture even?
Yeah, absolutely. I think really the latter would be the number one piece in our book. And it's, well, first of all, it's understanding your risk culture, really understanding it. And I think it's a simple statement, but it's a lot more difficult than it sounds. And culture is a very difficult thing, to get to grips with. And I think the culture is what people do when no one's looking, right? And it's not governed by handbooks and pure governance and policies. So it's really, the organizations and boards that really want to increase their resilience, move forward in terms of their risk management, getting to grips and getting underneath the risk culture, I think is critical. And we're starting to see a lot more focus on that. I think there should be more, but again, it's difficult. It's time consuming, and that is an investment. But that would be one of the number one investments that I would like to see more of.
Yeah, to that point, curious to know what's more important in your eyes, having the perfect risk framework or getting people to actually follow it, because they can be two different problems to deal with.
You're exactly right. I think, obviously you can't say both, but if you have a perfect framework and no one's following it, it doesn't matter. And actually that's sometimes where we see, and if you look in history and see some of the bigger, risk-led issues that have been material for companies, even taking some down, it's often come down to behaviors, right? And that risk culture. So bad things can happen to great companies, and especially if you're really not understanding how these policies and frameworks are actually translating and the leaders are actually buying into the culture.
So we talked about, CRO functions, but also risk leadership in general being an investment. What would you say to, leaders in APAC that still view risk leadership as a cost center rather than a value driver? What would your one key message be to them?
Good luck. No, I think in all seriousness, that is something that needs to change. And I think all you have to do is look at the news every day and see everything that's happening. And, it's a really tough time, I think, to be a CEO or any C-suite leader right now. And I think it's critical, that the C-suite leadership, lock arms and really kind of drive the strategic priorities across all functions. And I think we're seeing that in both risk and all control functions really step into the light and be required to be more commercial and strategic.
Yeah, Ashley, I know you don't hold an official title as a CRO at Russell Reynolds Associates, but how do you deal with risk at your company?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's important to walk the talk. That piece I said around culture, I think that's a real focus that we have here at Russell Reynolds. So, of course, we have robust policies and frameworks, et cetera, but it really comes down to a very specific set of behaviors and values that are modeled from the top of the house and across all of our partnership. And really that's how we drive that risk mitigation, ensuring that our behaviors are really, matching our policies.
Yeah. So Ashley, for the people listening who are aspiring CROs, what kind of skills or qualities really set the best CROs apart from the rest, especially in sectors where risk is, constantly shifting or really hard to define?
It's a great question, Audrey, and it's changed, a lot. And I think we did a recent, study and spoke to hundreds of CROs, C-suite leaders, et cetera, really asking this question. What are the most important skill set required to succeed these days as a CRO? And you might be surprised at kind of the top answers. Enterprise strategist, adaptive and agile, relationship cultivator. Those are among some of the top. I can list more. Those are ones that really stood out because these are qualities that you may not have associated in the past with chief risk officers. So I think to those who are aspiring or coming up the curve and knocking on the door of becoming that C-suite risk leader, it's really thinking through how they can be more agile, keep up to date on technological advancements, really lean into relationships and influencing, and don't just, stay in the box.
Yeah, Ashley, final question. I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you had to run a 15-minute training session on risk for all staff, what would you focus on?
Culture.
Wow.
Wow, okay.
No
one-word
there.
answer. Pearls of wisdom from Ashley Wallace. Huh? There you go.
There you go. We've been talking about how the chief risk officer is evolving from back office watchdog to forward-thinking strategist and why risk leadership is fast becoming a competitive edge. Ashley, thanks so much for your time and insights today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Audrey. Thanks, Ahmed.
Thank you. Ashley Wallace is the Managing Director, Head of Financial Services Asia Pacific at Russell Reynolds Associates. Stay with Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.